In April 2012, a young woman named Brenda Becks left her small hometown and relocated to Greenville, North Carolina. Her move was driven by a desire to change her life and fulfill her dream of meeting the man of her dreams, starting her own family, and achieving something greater. Little did she know that this dream would soon turn into a living nightmare. The beginning. Brenda came from a small town where her potential was considerably limited. She had always dreamed of more, a bigger life, greater opportunities, and most importantly, the love of her life. Moving to Greenville was her bold step towards this dream. Initially, adapting to the new environment was challenging. Brenda had no one to lean on in difficult times, no familiar faces to turn to. However, she gradually expanded her circle of acquaintances and began making friends. Among her new friends was a married couple who Brenda particularly admired. She looked up to their relationship and often found herself imagining having a similar bond with her future partner. Meeting Paul Edwards. One day, Brenda gathered the courage to ask this couple if they knew any single men who might be suitable for her. To her surprise, they were immediately excited about the idea and soon introduced her to a man named Paul Edwards. They showed her a photograph of Paul, and Brenda liked him at first sight. The couple arranged a meeting for Brenda and Paul. When they met in person, Paul turned out to be not only physically attractive, but also sweet, kind, and courteous. To Brenda, he seemed like her knight in shining armor, large, strong, and capable of protecting her from any trouble. Paul was equally taken with Brenda. He appreciated her modesty and charm, qualities that reminded him of his small-town upbringing. As they shared stories about their pasts, Brenda found herself increasingly comfortable with Paul. By the end of their first date, they both felt a strong connection and decided to continue getting to know each other. Falling in love. Their relationship progressed rapidly. Dates turned into weekends spent together, and soon they were inseparable. Brenda introduced Paul to her mother, who approved of him wholeheartedly. Paul also took Brenda to meet his grandmother, who had raised him. Despite her initial surprise at the speed of their relationship, Paul's grandmother liked Brenda and was happy for her grandson. In Brenda's eyes, everything was perfect. She felt that her decision to move to Greenville was the best one she had ever made. After a few months of dating, Brenda and Paul decided it was time to move in together. They were spending almost every waking moment together anyway, so this seemed like a natural progression. The honeymoon phase. The first few months of living together were blissful. Brenda was madly in love and cherished every minute spent with Paul. They were in the honeymoon phase, and the future looked bright and full of promise. However, as time went on, subtle changes began to occur. Brenda started to notice that she had lost contact with most of her friends. She had been devoting all her attention to Paul, neglecting other relationships. When she mentioned to Paul that she missed her friends and wanted to meet up with them, he would always agree and support her plan. However, every time a meeting with her friends was scheduled, Paul would come up with a surprise or plan for the evening, causing Brenda to cancel her plans. The red flags. Initially, Brenda didn't think much of these coincidences. She was flattered by Paul's attention and his desire to spend time with her. But as these instances repeated, she began to feel isolated. Whenever she tried to discuss this with Paul, he would accuse her of being ungrateful and not appreciating his efforts. Paul's manipulative behavior gradually increased. He began controlling various aspects of Brenda's life. He didn't like certain clothes she wore, so he persuaded her to change her wardrobe. He disliked makeup, so Brenda stopped using it to please him. Each time she conformed to his preferences, she felt like she was losing a part of herself, but she convinced herself that it was worth it to make the relationship work. The isolation. Over the following months, Brenda's social isolation deepened. Paul disapproved of her talking to her family, and soon she stopped calling them altogether. Her wardrobe was completely altered to fit Paul's tastes, and she abandoned all her previous interests and hobbies to focus solely on him. Paul's control extended to every aspect of Brenda's life. He would get anxious if she didn't conform to his opinions and preferences. Disagreements, no matter how small, would escalate quickly. Paul started becoming physically aggressive, grabbing Brenda by the arms or neck during arguments. These incidents began with light grips, but soon evolved into stronger displays of aggression. The turning point. After 10 months of their relationship, Paul had transformed into someone Brenda barely recognized. He was constantly irritated and rough, often working himself up over trivial matters. One night, during an argument, Brenda asked if their future would always be like this. Instead of answering, Paul grabbed her by the neck and threatened her life. That night, as she lay in bed, Brenda couldn't stop thinking about how her life had come to this. At first, she blamed herself, wondering if she had somehow provoked Paul. But then it hit her. It wasn't her fault. Paul was the one acting irrationally and violently. The decision to leave. Realizing the danger she was in, Brenda knew she had to leave Paul. But it wasn't going to be easy. Paul knew where she worked, where her family lived, and he would never let her leave without a fight. She had no friends to turn to, as her relationships with them had dwindled to nothing. She had distanced herself from her family, and Paul controlled every aspect of her life, even making her delete her social media accounts. Every day was the same. Brenda would go to work, come home to Paul, and remain isolated from the outside world. Paul monitored her phone calls and messages, taking away her keys and phone at night. Brenda had become a prisoner in her own life. The final straw. The tipping point came when Paul's behavior escalated to sexual violence. Initially, their intimate life had been consensual, but it soon turned into Paul forcing himself on Brenda whenever he wanted. Brenda's resistance seemed to excite him, and she realized it was easier to comply than to fight. One morning, after a particularly violent night, Paul was working on fixing the kitchen faucet. As Brenda walked into the kitchen and saw a heavy wrench on the floor, a terrible thought crossed her mind. What if she used it to free herself from Paul's control? Fortunately, before she could act on this thought, there was a knock at the door. It was their landlady. Brenda went outside to speak with her, and in a moment of desperation, she broke down and told the landlady everything. She poured out her heart, describing the months of abuse and control. The landlady, shocked and sympathetic, called the police. The escape. The police arrived quickly and arrested Paul. For the first time in months, Brenda felt a sense of relief. She believed her nightmare was finally over. However, her relief was short-lived. The next day, Paul was released. Brenda was driving when she saw Paul's truck in her rearview mirror. Panic set in as he approached her at high speed, trying to intimidate her. She pulled over to call the police, but Paul rammed his truck into her car, forcing her off the road. In the chaos, Brenda managed to escape and drive to the nearest police station. Seeking safety. At the police station, Brenda filed a restraining order against Paul. With the help of the authorities, she moved to a women's shelter, a place where she could begin to rebuild her life. She reconnected with her family, who had been worried sick about her. Slowly, Brenda started to regain her sense of self and independence. Brenda's story is a harrowing reminder of how quickly a dream can turn into a nightmare. Her journey from a hopeful young woman seeking love and a better life to a victim of domestic abuse highlights the importance of recognizing red flags in a relationship and the need for a strong support system. Today, Brenda is an advocate for domestic abuse survivors. She shares her story to help others recognize the signs of an abusive relationship and encourages them to seek help. Her experience has made her stronger and more determined to live a life free from fear and control. Brenda's journey is a powerful example of how one can overcome adversity and reclaim their life.